Hello, and welcome to Finale to Dorico, Conquering the Transition. My name is Jason Lafredo, and I will be your host of what will be a short collection of videos helping you make the transition between Finale and Dorico as seamless as possible. So in these videos, I'm going to be showing you both programs side by side, and I'm hoping that this will help you connect the concepts that you're familiar with in Finale to similar, or in some cases, brand new concepts in Dorico. So I really want to state something at the outset here. Finale and Dorico are both professional level music notation software programs, right? They both lead you to the very same conclusion, which is essentially the printed music. However, how you get from A to B can be very different in both programs. But you should know that at this point, there is essentially nothing that Finale can do that Dorico simply can't. So if you do get stuck on something in Dorico, it's most likely that there's an easy way to do it, but you just haven't figured it out yet. And I would encourage you to think back to when you first learned Finale, right? You were likely in the same boat. So don't panic, breathe. I'm here to help you get over this initial learning hump. Ultimately, my goal here is to really focus on how Dorico works on sort of a macro and structural level, but definitely along the way, I'm going to give you enough of the basics on a lot of topics so that hopefully as you move forward, you'll have the momentum that you need to learn more and more of the details. I really think that once you understand the macro concepts and some of the structure and theory behind Dorico, it's going to be much easier for you to figure things out on your own, and also with the help of some of the other great tutorials that already exist for Dorico, you're really going to be well on your way. So let's start at the beginning. I'm actually going to close these windows, and in Dorico, I'm going to open the hub. Now, normally when you open Dorico for the first time, this is the first thing you see. In Finale, we have something similar. Oops, if I close that, if you go to launch window, right? This is the equivalent in Finale. So these two windows are very similar. In the Steinberg hub, we have the Open Recent tab, the Create New tab, there's a Learn tab, and a What's New tab. This is something that the launch window doesn't have. But the first three, we have versions of that in the launch window, right? You create new music here, open existing music, and there's a Learning Center here on the bottom left. So this is a very self-explanatory window. I'm not going to spend too much time going over the Steinberg hub here, but I am going to point out one thing specifically. In the launch window for Finale, you have this default document option, and as you know, that will open a completely blank file. There'll be one staff, and it's all the basic settings. There's sort of a similar thing in the Steinberg hub. If you go to Create New, on the left, if you choose the empty template, there's one option here for an empty file. And by selecting that, it will indeed give you an empty file, except that it's completely empty. There's not even an instrument or a staff there yet. Otherwise, when you're working with Dorico, I really do suggest finding one of the templates that's kind of closest to what you need or exactly what you need and choosing that to start, right? And then from there, you have all this stuff on the right, and this is very similar to Finale's Setup Wizard. Finale's Setup Wizard will take you through a bunch of windows in a row. This is all done in one place, but it's very similar, right? You would choose the ensemble that you want, press next. You can add some extra instruments if you want, press next. You can add some title information, right? There's a lot of similar things here on the right, project title, composers. You go next on the Finale side, and you can select the time and key signature, right? You have those options here as well. So again, it's pretty self-explanatory, pretty similar to Finale's launch window. That is the Steinberg hub when you first open Dorico. But we're going to close these and actually go back to those files that I had open before. So I want to start on a big macro level item here insofar as the difference between Finale and Dorico, right? In Finale, this is what we call a modeless application. What that means is that you're basically working in a single environment. In this case, you're looking at the score. I mean, you can look at other parts. You do actually have scroll view versus page view, but generally it's the same environment and you have a bunch of tools. So in order to manipulate things on the page, you would actually switch tools down here, right? This is a modeless application with tools. Dorico, on the other hand, is a moded application. It has 5 modes, and they can be found in the top left corner. They are Setup, Write, Engrave, Play, and Print mode. And as you can see, as I'm going through all of those modes, the environment in the middle of the window is changing, right? And the concept here is that within these modes, you can do certain tasks, and they're sort of siloed in certain ways, right? So in the Write mode, for example, this is where you're going to be writing everything. In the Setup mode, this is where you're going to be setting things up. Obviously in the print mode, you're printing, right? This is the concept here. The modes themselves will present different options in different ways. So this is a big difference between Finale and Dorico. And I'm just going to kind of very briefly go through all of these modes with you, but know that we're going to come back to these and I'm going to hit these in much more detail later. So starting with setup mode, as you can imagine, this is where you're going to do all of your setup. And this is where you're going to add instruments. This is where you're going to deal with layouts. At the bottom, you have a thing called flows. And I'm going to get into this a lot more when we talk about setup mode, but flows you can think of as individual movements within a larger piece. You're going to do all of that work here. Now we had similar functionality in Finale. It's just that it's kind of in different places, right? So in Finale, if you go to the score manager, right, you know that if you're in the instrument list, you can add instruments here. You can go to the document menu to go to the manage parts window. And this is where you can actually set up different parts. You can do things like, you know, set up a special percussion score. In Dorico, all of that is handled in this one mode. You can add instruments on the left. You can add layouts. You can add custom layouts on the right. There's a lot of things that you can do in this one environment here. So in Dorico's write mode, the second mode, this is where, as you can imagine, you're going to do all of your writing. This is where you're going to be adding things like adding notes and rhythms and time signatures and keys and clefs and articulations and ornaments and all of that good stuff, right? And the way that we do this in Dorico is different than Finale, but mostly involves things in the left panel or the right panel. Now, in the right panel, you have a bunch of things that kind of look similar to Finale's tools, and indeed they sort of do operate the same way. Like you can select the clefs and then add the clefs by, you know, clicking these options or the time signatures or the key signatures, etc., right? You can absolutely do that, but the other way that we add items in Dorico is through a system of popovers. And the way that popovers work, if I just zoom in a little bit here, is that it's always a shift and a letter to add a certain item. So if I press Shift O, for example, this is the ornament popover, and I can just type TR and hit return, and I'll get a trill. Now this is sort of similar to Finale's meta key tool system. It's a little bit different. The popovers are a little bit more complex. There's a whole list of popovers. Again, we'll get into this in much more detail when we talk more specifically about write mode. But again, the items here on the right are sort of similar ideas to the tool palette in Finale, with one major difference, right? In Finale, the tools themselves are organized graphically, right? So if I go into the articulation tool, right, and I open this articulation selection window, you'll know that you have articulations. The first few items, all of these are actual articulations, right? But this, the mordant, is an ornament. The trill is an ornament. These guys here, these are fingerings. The fermata is a hold. You have techniques, you have bowings, right? They're not all technically articulations, right? They're just in the articulation tool because these items attach to the notes in a very similar way. They're graphically similar. They're not musically similar, right? Same thing with the Smart Shape tool. You have slurs and hairpins and trills and octave lines. Musically, they're completely unrelated in a lot of ways, but they are similar insofar that they have a beginning point, an end point, and they can be stretched, etc., right? Same thing with the expression tool. You know, if we go here, we know we have dynamics, tempo marks, alterations, expressive text, techniques, rehearsal marks, and you can create all kinds of other types of text type items, right? And again, they're all lumped together in this expression tool because they are similar graphically, right? In Dorico, everything is organized by their musical function. So if I open the dynamics panel on the right here, you'll see all of your dynamics, but you'll also see hairpins. Again, in Finale, this was from two different tools. It was the expression tool and the Smart Shape tool. But in Dorico, they lump them together because they are musically similar, and objectively that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? And there's a lot of subtlety and nuance to how this is organized. One of my favorites that constantly trips up Finale users is the octave line. So, you know, in Finale, you go to the Smart Shapes to get to the octave lines, right? And it's pretty easy to double click and add an octave line. Well, in Dorico, the octave lines don't exist in the line tool. You see, you do have a line tool and there's a bunch of lines, but there's no octave lines, right? That's because octave lines are actually more similar to clefs in how they function. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You take a note at a certain pitch, D5, right? D5 is D5 is D5. If you put that on a treble clef, it's going to be on a location in the staff. If you put that on bass clef, it's going to be in a location very high in the staff, right? But it's still a D5. Octave lines are sort of the same idea. You're representing that D5 in a different way. On a treble clef, the D5 would be down an octave, but you'd have the octave line, but it's still a D5, right? So it's funny, but the octave lines are actually functionally more like clefs than they are like lines. So that's why they exist here. And it's like this for a reason. These items all have certain properties, right? We're going to get into the properties panel on the bottom here at some point. But all of these properties have different things related to the type of item it is. So a clef will have a certain property. An octave line is going to have very similar properties. So that's why they exist in the similar tools. So it's just weird to get used to, but that's the first thing you really need to wrap your head around, is that Finale is going to organize by how things look graphically, whereas Dorico is going to organize things more musically. The third mode in Dorico is called engrave mode, and this is where you're going to be doing all of the engraving tasks. Now, what exactly is an engraving task? Well, an engraving task can be anything from just very subtly changing the offsets of an item, like this legato marking. You can do things with the text frames in this subtool. You can do things with the vertical spacing in the third tool here. The fourth tool is going to give you some options for note spacing. This is something for graphic slices. In this first tool, again, you can move items around. You can do things like change the arc of a slur if you need to, right? You can also format the music. You can change the way the music is cast off in engrave mode. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to do with page templates. This is like sort of the design of the titles and all that stuff. This is a whole new system that's unique to Dorico. There's things with flow headings and all that stuff. So anything that's like sort of related to the overall look of the score is going to be in engrave mode. Now we have similar functions in Finale, and the slurs are a good example of this. In engrave mode, again, I can click that slur and you'll see your handles, and you can adjust the arc of the slur as needed, right? In Finale, it's sort of different. I mean, you're just using the tool that those things were created in, right? So in the Smart Shape tool, I would select this and I get my 5 handles, and I can do similar things with the slurs, right? It's just that in Dorico, you have to be in engrave mode in order to manipulate the slur in the same way. If you're in write mode and you select a slur, you can see that the slur only has 2 handles now. You can't actually change the arc of the slur, because changing the arc is sort of manipulating the look of it a little bit. So that's an engraving task. In write mode, what you can do is reassign the slur so that it goes to a different note, right? So this is the difference between write and engrave mode. And it is a little bit interesting to get used to that in Dorico versus Finale, but there are some really legitimately good reasons for this. So if I go back to Finale real quick, and I look at this legato marking, which is in the expression text, right? Sometimes it's very easy if you're like moving things around, like you just kind of jump with your hand or something, and all of a sudden that legato, if you can see the attachment point, is now attached to the viola part, and you can still move it down sort of close enough to the piano part to make it look like it's attached to the piano part, right? But again, look at that attachment line. It's actually attached to the viola. This is a problem because later on, this legato mark is going to show up in the viola part, but not the piano part, right? So you do have to be careful about making sure you're not moving things incorrectly and getting them reattached. Well, in Dorico, the difference between write and engrave mode is sort of automatically preventing this from happening. So if I'm in write mode and I move this legato, I can't move it up and down. I can't change the staffs, right? But I can sort of move it left and right within the same instrument. However, in engrave mode, I can change the offsets a little bit. If I just need to tweak the position just a little bit, I can. In fact, I can move this legato really far, and you can still see the attachment point is still attached to the piano part, right? Even if it's above the viola. So it's really interesting that Dorico, silos the task like this, but I think it's really, it's good in a sense that it's safer in a lot of ways. Like you're not going to have those types of mistakes that you had in Finale where you sort of misattach something like that. Anyway, much more about engrave mode in subsequent videos. The fourth mode, play mode, and I'm just going to expand this a little bit here. This is completely unique to Dorico. Obviously, Finale has nothing like this. And you look at this and it kind of looks like a DAW. And in fact, it sort of is a mini DAW. You have your tracks and they look exactly like they would in Logic or something. Actually, more specifically, they look like they do in Cubase, because Cubase. Cubase is also a Steinberg product. Dorico and Cubase share a little bit of code, I think, between the in-play mode and Dorico. So there's actually some cross-functionality here. If you know Cubase, this is going to look very familiar to you. And you have your standard things. Your tracks are here on the left. You have your mute and solo buttons. This whole left area is where you're going to be dealing with instruments and sounds. You can even insert effects, and there's a channel thing here. And on the bottom, you have a mixer here. You can do certain things with this, but if you select the second button over here, this is called the key editor, which is essentially a piano roll editor. And if I scroll over a little bit in the vocal part, yeah, you'll start to see some of the note events that exist. And you can actually manipulate these. You can change the values of these, change the lengths. You can adjust the timing of how it sounds. There's a difference between the notated durations versus the played durations. So there's a lot of neat stuff that you can do in the play mode. And again, this is completely unique. Finale doesn't have anything like this, and neither does any of the other notation programs for that matter. So, and the last mode you have here is print mode. And this is a relatively simple environment for dealing with printing. You have the layouts on the left that you can choose from, and on the right you have the destination, and it can go to the printer or it can go to graphics, different types of graphics and all that stuff. And there's just a little bit of nice flexibility in what you can do, duplex printing, what pages, you can print only certain flows, etc. So yeah, it's just a nice little interface for dealing with printing. Obviously in Finale, you'd press Command P to get to the print menu, and you can do some similar things here, but it's not quite as flexible as Dorico's. But yeah, so that's the final print mode. And this is where I'm going to tell you should learn some shortcuts to switch between these modes, because you're going to be switching a lot. And it's fairly easy. On a Mac, it's Command 1 for setup mode, Command 2 for write mode, Command 3 for engrave mode, 4 for play mode, and Command 5 for print mode. On Windows, I believe it's Control 1 through 5. If you memorize nothing else, memorize those. Also, Command 6 will open and close the top menu bar here, although, it's so skinny, I never really need to close that. Command 7 will open and close the left panel. Command 8 will open and close the bottom panel, which we're definitely going to be using a lot, particularly in write and engrave mode, to get into the properties panel. So Command 8 is a pretty important one, and Command 9 will open and close the write panel. So that's Command 1 through 9, basically, for all of those modes and panels. And I think it's worth noting that the original designer's intent behind Dorico is that the user really should work in order, right? You should do everything in setup mode, Command 1, do all of your setup, add your players, add your layouts, etc. When that's all done, go to write mode, do all of your writing. When you've got all the writing done, go to engrave mode, make your tweaks, whatever they need to be. Then maybe go to play mode if you want to tweak some playback, and then go to print mode to print everything, right? It's sort of designed to be done in order. However, I get it. Like, we're human beings. Sometimes we just have to jump back and forth between things, or we have to come back to something. It's not always going to be possible to perfectly silo the tasks like that. So this is, again, where it's important to memorize those keystrokes, especially going back between write and engrave mode. I find myself going back between those two modes a lot. The thing is, we never really had anything similar to that in Finale. We were never even subconsciously suggested to us that we should work in that particular order. So it is something that we definitely get used to. And, again, you don't have to perfectly silo your tasks like that. It's perfectly fine to go back and forth. But, I found that the more that I use Dorico, I find myself doing that naturally anyway. Like, I find myself doing as much writing as I can in write mode before I do go into engrave mode. In Finale, I would always go back and forth between those tasks all the time. Like, I'd put in a few notes and then fix the things, you know what I mean? But you don't have to do that in Dorico. And I think as you get going with it more, you'll find that it's a little bit more efficient to kind of work in order as much as possible. So as you're familiar with, Finale has page view, and if you press Command E, you'll get into scroll view, right? Dorico has something similar. They have page view, but they have something called galley view instead of scroll view. And you can find that on the bottom here. It's over here, page view, galley view. There's also fill view. The shortcuts are a little bit different. It's not a toggle Command E to go back and forth, but Command Option 1 will get you into page view, Command Option 2 will get you into galley view, and Command Option 3 will get you into fill view. And you can see that galley view is basically the same thing as Finale's scroll view. It's just an endless scroll of measures like that. In version 6, they added this fill view, again, Command Option 3, which is sort of a nice variation of galley view. It's sort of the same idea, except that when the music gets to the end of the screen, it wraps around again, so you have another version of it. If you remember in, scroll view, the problem is that you have only one horizontal plane and you have a lot of empty space at the bottom, right? So you always have to go to the right. So fill view is sort of a nice little compromise, especially for ensembles around this size, 4, 5, 6 staves. This works really well. It's not as noticeable when you have a full score because that's going to take up the total vertical space anyway. But with these types of score, it's really nice. And what's cool is that as you zoom in, it actually changes where it spills over, right? So this is this bar here, and I can zoom in a little bit. That's a different bar. It'll always just go to the end of the screen and then go down. If you scroll all the way out, you can ultimately see everything in the score in fill view. So that's a nice little variation of galley view. Again, Command Option 1, 2, and 3 to switch between page, galley, and fill view. Finale also had something called Studio View, which is Command-Shift+E, which is just a variation of scroll view with just some track headers. This was maybe the genesis of something that Finale might have been doing, similar to what Dorico ended up doing with play mode. Obviously, it just never really developed much further than that, and Dorico's play mode is pretty different than that anyway. Now, Finale, as you're familiar, has linked parts, and if you go to the document menu, you just find them here, edit part, and you can actually go to one of the parts or go back to the score. And there were shortcuts for this, which was Command Option period would move you forward through the linked parts, or comma would move you backwards through the linked parts, or wherever you were, Command Option / would take you back to the score, and once again would take you back to the previously viewed part, right? There is a similar idea in Dorico. They don't call them linked parts, they just call them layouts, and the layouts are found right next to the mode buttons here. And right here, you just, in this pull down menu, you can choose one of the other layouts like that. And there is similar shortcuts, different keys, of course. In Dorico, it is Option-Shift right bracket will move you forward, and left bracket will move you backwards. And to get back to the score, it's different because you don't need modifier keys. You just use the W key, and that will send you back to the score. And what's nice about the W key is that when you're in the score, if you select something, if I select this note in the viola and press W, it will take me to the viola part, W to go back to the score. And then I press select something in the piano part, W takes me to the piano layout. So that's kind of clever, is that, depending on what you're selecting, you can go to that particular layout. Now in Finale, when you add instruments in the score manager, it always adds a linked part, and you can always manipulate these in the manage parts window. It's very similar in Dorico. Whenever you add a player in setup mode, it's also going to automatically add a layout in setup mode as well, and you can also create custom layouts and stuff, just similar to how you do it in the manage parts window in Finale. Again, more about setup mode in the next video, actually. And the last thing I want to touch on today is document options, right? So we know in Finale, if you do Command Option A, you can get to these document options. And this controls exactly how the score looks. There's a lot of categories for a lot of things. You can adjust the positionings and all kinds of things that you can adjust in the document options. The thing about Finale is that there's other options that exist, like in the Smart Shapes tool, for example, in the Smart Shapes menu, if you do go to Smart Shapes options, there's additional document options. Similar to the document options proper, these get attached to the file and you can make the same adjustments. Some things are just check marks, like in the chord menu, for example. If you want to left align chords, you have to do it here. Just check that box instead of making a change in the document options, right? There's a lot of different places where you can adjust the look of the score in Finale. In Dorico, it's a little bit different. Everything exists in the library menu, particularly about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way down. These options here, engraving, layout, notation, note input, and playback options. These are the main windows that you're going to be using to control a lot of different things in Dorico. Now, there's one major conceptual conceit that I think you have to make using Dorico, and that is that so much of the look of your score can be manipulated in these options. Just going into the engrave options, for example, you can see all of the categories here. I mean, there's just tons of options in this window for every possible thing that you can think of, right? And these are global document settings in very specific ways depending on which window you're in, right? Which means that if something in your score, anything, if there's something that you're not quite liking the look of, you 1000% should check these options, the engraving options or the notation options or the layout options in particular. Those three control a lot of the look of your score, right? And you should check there before you start making 1,000 manual adjustments in the score, because chances are the thing that you need to do is an option that's set globally. This is very different than Finale, where sometimes there's not quite as many options, and in order to do something, you use a plugin to make a change or something. In Dorico, there's so many things that can be changed in these options that you really should check here first. And it's sort of a core theory to Dorico that these options impart the design to the score, and the user's job ends up being to simply add the notes and markings and let Dorico do the work. More specifically, let Dorico's settings, which you can control, do the work of making the score look the way you want it to. But of course, once you have things set in these windows, you can always go back to the score, in write and engrave mode specifically, click on something, go into the properties panel, make some sort of change, whether locally or globally. In the engrave mode, there's different options or different properties in engrave and write mode for certain items. So, you can certainly make small changes to one or two things as needed, but the majority of the time, the thing that you're going to need is in one of those windows. And let me just give you a quick tutorial about how these work. First of all, again, if you're going to memorize shortcuts, these are more shortcuts to memorize. Command-Shift+E for engraving, L for layouts, and notation options is N. Command-Shift+E, L, and N in particular. And note input and playback options if you need to deal with those as well. But especially E, L, and N, it's worth memorizing. So Command-Shift+E to get to engraving options. The engraving options, basically all of these options here are going to affect the way that the file looks related to the design of items. So you're going to find things like whether or not it uses parentheses for this, or let's find something like beams, like how it's, the beams are set, or how the barn numbers, like the enclosures and all that. Like there's a lot of like positioning and things like that exist in the engraving options, right? So if it's related to a very specific look, it's probably in the engraving options, right? The layout options, again, Command-Shift+L to get to the layout options. This is going to be strictly related to things that are specific to the layouts. And layout options can be different between layouts. And when you open the layout options, you'll see on the right-hand column, you see all of your possible layouts, right? These would be the linked parts in Finale. What's really important in the layout options is to pay attention to what's selected in the right side, because when you have something selected in the right side, any changes that you make in any of these options are only going to affect that layout that's selected when you press the apply button on the bottom. So if you need to make an adjustment just to the full score, make sure that that's selected. If you need to make a specific adjustment just for the alto part, make sure that that's selected. For the viola part, you can select multiples. So if you need to select all the parts, there's some handy windows at the bottom. Select all. This little icon will select the score. This little music stand icon selects all of the parts. So you do just have to pay attention to what is selected when you are making changes, because you don't want to make changes to the wrong layout, etc. So that's basically how the layout options work. And again, this is related to things that could be different between layouts. Space size or the rastral size is a good example. You're going to have a different rastral size for the score versus the parts. So certain things with bar numbers, how they show up in parts and scores differently, right? All of these are layout options, right? And then notations options, Command-Shift+N, this is going to control the way that some of the basic notation is presented. There's a lot of things dealing with beams and note groupings and rest groupings and stuff like that. So it presents a bunch of like parameters and rules for how things are automatically created in Dorico, which again, of course, you can override individually. With the notation option specifically, if you look at the right, this is actually broken down by flows. So you can actually set the notation options differently between different flows. Just make sure if you want to change the notation options for all the flows, just make sure that you have select all selected so that you are making changes. Otherwise, you're going to be making notation option changes just to a single flow. And while we're here, let me show you one thing specifically about this. So let me just close here. I'm going to scroll over to the second movement, right? And I'm going to point out some things here. Look at this. We're in 6/8, right? But you'll note that the rests are split quarter rest, eighth rest. You know, all of these rests should be really dotted quarter rest, eighth rest, quarter rest, eighth rest, right? I did this intentionally because this was how the original manuscript was written, and I was attempting to, you know, replicate the original manuscript. I should point out that I would never recommend this in modern notation. In 6/8 time, you really should do a dotted quarter rest. But again, if you're trying to replicate an old notation like I was, you can do this. Now, I could have gone through and like manually made all of these changes, but there is a notation option for this. So again, go back to notation options for the second movement. Again, make sure the second movement is selected. And in the rest category, if I scroll down just a little bit, compound meter, here it is, rest equal to the length of a compound beat. You see that I have this option selected, split at beat subdivisions for the second movement. If I actually select the first movement, you'll see that it selects this one. Now I should point out that this is the one that's set by default in the factory file, so obviously you're going to get the, you know, the more modern way of doing this, but it does give you the option to do it quote unquote wrong, and I made that selection for the second movement. Now if I undo this, so if I go back to the original here and hit apply, again make sure it's the second movement, hit apply and press close, you can see that it does this automatically. All of those rests now get changed to dotted quarter rest in the modern style. So again, this is what I mean by allowing the options to dictate the look of the score as much as possible. Go back here, select this again, and choose the other option to get it to the old method of rests in 6/8 time. So again, this is sort of, you know, what I'm talking about. You don't need to manually change all of this stuff. Again, if you're trying to do something like this, there's a really good chance that there's a notation option for it. And one more thing about these windows, in all three of these windows, there's this option at the bottom called Save as Default. So if you make a bunch of changes in the notation or engraving options, and that's the way that you like to see things, you can always click the Save as Default button, and then next time you open a new file, it will basically use those settings. And of course, you can always reset to factory if you need to. But yeah, that's really handy so that you don't have to keep making those changes. And then the other thing I'll say is that there are a bunch of different items in the library menu besides these options. The top section has to do with fonts, music fonts, and paragraph styles and stuff. There's things you can do with chords and note heads and playing techniques and lines and all this stuff. Basically, this is all, you know, the equivalent of all of those items in Finale in the document options, right? It's just that they're in a little bit different places, but at least they're all in one menu, the library menu right here. And the last thing I'll say here is that if you do have the time, I really would recommend opening these windows, especially the engraving, layout, and notation option windows. Just open this window, spend a half an hour, just literally going through every single option, scrolling through, reading what they do, reading what can be changed. That's like one of the hurdles here, is that you don't know what can be changed until you go into these windows and look, right? So, you know, before you get too far in Dorico, have a look through these windows. You'll start to understand like exactly what can be manipulated, and also you'll start to learn the difference between what an engraving option is versus a notation option versus a layout option. If you have the time, I really can't recommend this enough. Just go through and read everything. All right, so that's all I have to say about this. Hopefully this has helped. I know I've been speaking a lot about more structural things, but I think this will be super helpful. And from here, we're going to dive into a little bit more specifics about the individual modes, starting with setup mode in the next video. So thanks for watching, and I will see you soon on the next one.